Well, one of my all-time favorite movies was a movie called A Few Good Men. It came out about 30 years ago. It was written as a story about two young Marines who were put on trial for the death of a fellow Marine at the Guantanamo Bay military base. Now, when the movie begins, it seems pretty clear what had happened. There was no doubt that these two accused individuals, rather, had assaulted the man who died. Nor was there any doubt that the assault led to his death. But what makes the story complicated as it starts to unfold is that they share that they had been ordered to assault him. It wasn't something that they wanted to do. It came from the top. Now, this order was never written down. It wasn't put in any kind of official record, but it becomes clear over the course of the movie that it ultimately came from the presiding officer of Guantanamo Bay, Colonel Nathan Jessup. Now, these two eventually get represented by a young idealistic lawyer who is played by Tom Cruise. And he takes them all the way to court, ends up representing them in court, and brings Colonel Jessup, who's played by Jack Nicholson, on the stand. And as he's asking him questions and they're going back and forth, it gets Colonel Jessup really fired up, and he ends up giving one of the most famous speeches in movie history. And I thought that it would be worth reading a part of it this morning. I'm not going to do it as well as Jack Nicholson, nor am I going to try to do a Jack Nicholson impression, but here goes. Son, we live in a world that has walls, and those walls have to be guarded by men with guns. Who's going to do it? You? Lieutenant Weinberg? I have a greater responsibility than you can possibly fathom. You weep for Santiago, the Marine who was killed, and you curse the Marines. You have that luxury. You have the luxury of not knowing what I know. That Santiago's death, while tragic, probably saved lives. And my existence, while grotesque and incomprehensible to you, saves lives. You don't want the truth, because deep down in places you don't talk about at parties, you want me on that wall. You need me on that wall. I have neither the time nor the inclination to explain myself to a man who rises and sleeps under the blanket of the very freedom that I provide and then questions the manner in which I provide it. I would rather that you just said thank you and went on your way. Otherwise, I suggest you pick up a weapon and stand the post. Now, part of what has made that speech so striking, besides the acting behind it, is the fact that this scene seems to represent two conflicting views that are common in the United States. You have a kind of idealism represented well by Tom Cruise's character. He's this young person. He knows about law. He believes in due process. He thinks that these principles ought to be followed. But then you also have this other view that's represented by Jack Nicholson's character. It's a cynicism. It's a view that thinks that these principles, this justice is nice and all, but what really makes the world work, what really makes people safe, is power. Men with guns guarding walls. And he's willing to tolerate the views, the speeches of young idealists who talk about democracy and freedom and hope and policies, up to the point that it comes in conflict with his power. That's something that he cannot give up because ultimately that is what holds it all together in his view. Now, Jack Nicholson is supposed to be the villain in this movie, but it seems that his speech has resonated with a number of people over the years. This sense that the speaking about solutions and naive thinking ultimately just gets in the way of the real people who keep us safe, who make things work, those who wield power. And I feel like I have heard some version of this speech coming up even in recent weeks, when we've seen all of this gun violence, which just continues to unfold at a sickening level. And we hear some say, well, maybe we should be able to change our policies. We should make stricter gun laws. We should have background checks. There are others who say, that doesn't matter, you fools. People who break the law aren't paying attention to that. The only thing that stops people is raw power. And there is something about that shakes me up a little bit when I hear that. I mean, I certainly don't have any doubt that we could use better background checks and things along those lines. But the truth be told, for me as a follower of Jesus who believes in nonviolence, I don't know what I would have done outside of the Uvalde school that would have been better than the police officers who ultimately used violence to stop the shooter. I don't know. There is something that resonates about this word of power. And it's not just with physical violence, too. We hear it in other ways. We hear it from people who say compromising is just a foolish and naive thing to do. Don't try to work things out, whether they're with political enemies or people with different theological views. You just have to force your will through. It's all about power. Don't forgive people. Don't give people second chances. People don't really change. Ultimately, the only thing that keeps us safe as a community is excluding threats, is holding on to power. I think there is a cynicism even inside of us that says at times, I'm not going to be able to find hope in the situation that I'm in. I'm not going to find healing. I'm not going to be able to break a habit or work out a problem. I might as well do something that's not ideal, but at least it will keep me somewhat safe. These are all echoes of this same kind of speech. But of the two views that I described, neither of them are exactly Christian. It's true that some of us might share in common the idealism of those who hope that policy changes and the goodness of humanity can make things better. But ultimately, the Christian response to cynicism is not a belief in the goodness of humanity, but faith. Faith is what keeps us from giving up on doing things the right way. And so what do I mean by faith? Well, Hebrews offers a helpful definition of it almost immediately at the beginning of chapter 11. Frank actually quoted the version that I learned as well when I was first growing up, that now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. And Frank, I'm glad that was a meaningful thing to you, but I have to say that version of this verse was a hard one for me for many years. Because it didn't make any sense to me why you would be sure of what you hope for. That just seems like being naive, right? I've watched sports games with people who they'd hope their team would win, and then all of a sudden they just start saying, "I know they're going to win. I believe it. I just feel it in my bones." And I would think you're crazy. Like that doesn't do anything. There's that's foolish confidence. And if that's what this kind of passage is talking about, it doesn't make sense to me. So the NIV itself even kind of shifted the language just slightly, saying that faith is confidence about what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. As it turns out, this is a very complicated statement in Greek. There's different ways to interpret these words. And actually, the interpretation that I find the most helpful is faith is confidence about what we hope for and evidence about what we do not see. A word that's used by the Common English Bible and even the King James, among some others. But why does that help? Why does it make a difference to say that faith is confidence about what we hope for? Well, in my mind, the difference is that confidence has less to do with just what you're thinking in your head and more about what leads you to act. Confidence or conviction is what gives you the boldness you need to act out your beliefs. And this makes sense in what follows in Hebrews. Because while the passages that follow certainly talk about beliefs to some extent, the examples of faith it gives are less about people believing things and more about people having the courage it takes to make difficult decisions. For example, we hear about Moses at one point in Hebrews saying, "By faith Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. By faith he left Egypt, unafraid of the king's anger." Now, does this mean that Moses, with his faith, never had any doubts or any questions? Absolutely not. We know that's not to be the case. Moses makes it clear that he had all sorts of doubts and insecurities about what he was supposed to be doing. But I think the point that Hebrews is making here is that he had enough faith to do the right thing and not even to give in to the fear that he had of Pharaoh's anger or of the consequences that could come, because he had confidence enough in what he hoped for. Or another example that Hebrews gives is that of Rahab, noting that by faith Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient because she'd received the spies in peace. Now, if you remember this story, this is a story about when the Israelites were marching around Jericho, and they first sent 2 spies into Jericho. And Rahab wasn't even from the Israelite community. She didn't even know God. So it's hard to imagine what it means when it says that she had faith here when she barely knew who God was. But apparently there was something inside of her that said the right thing to do is not to give up these spies. The right thing to do is to stick with what I believe is fair and safe and humane. And consequently, it was enough to allow her to act in a way that was courageous. But the example by far that Hebrews spends the most time exploring is that of Abraham. Abraham and Sarah in the Jewish and Christian and even Muslim traditions are considered the kind of founders of the faith because of a heroic decision that they made when they heard the voice of God tell them to pick up and move. So I want to read how Hebrews describes this. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to set out for a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he set out, not knowing where he was going. By faith he stayed for a time in a land he had been promised, as in a foreign land, living in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. So the first point that it makes is that Abraham obeyed this call even though he didn't know where he was going. And that's something that I think would be intimidating for any of us. If all of a sudden you had this call to pack up everything that you owned and load it in a U-Haul or something along those lines and then just leave without any plan of where you were going to land with it, that's a big risk. But as much as it's a risk in our time, it was even more so in the ancient world. Because he didn't know if he was going to be able to find a place that had an ample food source. It seemed that the city where he was living originally, he was able to have enough food to not only sustain himself, but a large family. And so the idea that you would leave something like this in the ancient world to go to the unknown seems extremely foolish. He didn't know if he was going to cross unknowingly some hostile territory where people might attack him, or if his family was going to face some kind of sickness or setback, and he would be separated from the only support system that exists, the family and friends he had back in the city of Haran. He didn't know these things. And yet he heard the voice of God calling him, and he stepped out in faith. And the faith wasn't just in that initial act either. It was something that continued in the way that he lived there. He didn't live like the people around him lived. They must have seen him and thought that he was idealistic or foolish or naive. When given a situation where he was in conflict with somebody over whether to have the good land or the lesser land, the good wells or the dry places, he often, for the sake of peace, chose the lesser for himself. He went around doing foolish things like buying property in places, building altars, buying a memorial site, even though he wasn't settled in that land and there was no guarantee that it was going to be protected and sustained by his future family. It seemed like foolishness. But it goes on to explain why he was engaged in this foolishness. And the key line, even though I think that the verse is wrong there, is by faith, with Sarah's involvement, he received the power of procreation even though he was too old, because he considered him faithful who had promised. It wasn't just that he was engaging in this wishful thinking and he really wanted it to be true, so he just went for it. It wasn't that he went through some kind of logical process and considered his options and it seemed like this was the best way to move forward either. It was that he had confidence in the one who called him. That voice of God, something about it inspired a trust to which he could move forward. And I would say that this is the point of the entire book of Hebrews. Hebrews is trying to give us the confidence to trust the one who calls us to live in a different kind of way. A way that may seem naive and foolish and risky and pointless to some, but which we can believe because of who it is who calls us. You see, in fact, that Hebrews uses this same language when talking about Jesus. Let us hold fast to the confession of our hope without wavering, because the one who has promised is faithful. And it goes on and it explores how all of the different aspects of Jesus, all of the things that we consider, from his divine nature as one who truly represents God, to his human nature as one who can relate to us, is designed to build us up and let us know that Jesus will walk through this with us. For example, back in chapter 4, we read that since we have a great high priest who's passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast to our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who in every respect has been tested as we are, yet without sin. The things that God calls us to do are not things that are impossible. They're not beyond us. Jesus himself was willing to put himself in our shoes to show us that there is a way to be faithful, to be hopeful, to come out the other side and do things right. But then the question just comes back, yeah, but what if I don't have that confidence in God, right? Like, what if I don't feel it? God's voice doesn't sound clear enough to me. God's ways, they sound nice, but I'm not sure that I'm willing to risk everything to make them work. Well, that's where the second half of this verse comes in. Faith is confidence about what we hope for and evidence about what we do not see. Because the funny thing about faith is as you start to have it, as you start to put your faith in God in little ways, God proves to be faithful. And this gives you the boldness to take bigger and bigger steps. I have to say, I would not be a person who would be committed to nonviolence were it not for Jesus. I wouldn't. When I look at the world, it doesn't seem like peace and understanding and talking things out is going to make things work. But I have found in my own life, in situations where I felt like conflict was irresolvable and nothing could work out, that when I followed the way of Jesus and humbled myself and prayed, Jesus got me through it. I have found in situations in my life when I felt like I had no power and I didn't know how something was going to be resolved, God would show up. And this confidence begins to cause us to act in a certain way, to live into the reality that is yet to come. And that's also what Hebrews describes for all of these people who went before us. It says all these died in faith without having received the promises. It's notable for Abraham especially that he never did get to see the promised land, the title or the deed come into his hands, right? It wasn't ever guaranteed that it would be there. But he did see it from a distance and greeted it. They confessed that they were strangers and foreigners on earth. Abraham did find that as he and Sarah took steps of faith, God would respond. God did provide them with a child, even though they were past the childbearing years. God did keep them safe, even when they were going into hostile territory. God did provide food and water and resources, and thus he became a living sign of an alternative reality. One that wasn't just based on wishful thinking or idealistic beliefs about how the world should be, but one that was based in the confidence in the one who has said, "This is what I will do." And if you step into this now, you can already see the fruits of it starting to emerge.